Before the monuments were raised and the portraits painted, before the armies and the oaths and the long weight of history settled upon a single name, there was only a river, red-banked and unhurried, moving through the Virginia morning as it had moved for 10,000 years before anyone thought to remember it. The Rappahannock River in February carries the color of pewter. Its surface in the early hours holds the sky's pale reflection, shifting and slow, the water moving without urgency between banks of red clay that glow faintly in the first light like embers cooling from the night. The trees along the shore stand bare in winter, their branches fine as ink lines drawn against a grey sky, their roots gripping the clay bank with the patient tenacity of things that have no reason to hurry. A February morning in 1732 along this shore would have looked very much as it looks now, the same river, the same clay, the same quality of cold light arriving without announcement across the flat water. Ferry Farm sits on the Stafford County side of the Rappahannock, its cleared fields running down toward the river's edge, the modest plantation house set back from the bank on slightly higher ground. The house itself is rendered in the warm amber tones of early firelight, a timber-framed structure of practical dimensions, its wide central chimney sending a thin column of wood smoke into the cold air, the smoke rising straight in the still morning before bending gently eastward in the river breeze. The split-rail fences enclosing the kitchen garden are silvered with frost, each rail carrying a thin line of white along its upper edge. The outbuildings stand in their familiar arrangement, smokehouse, stable, the small dependencies of a working farm, their rooflines dusted with the remnant of a recent snowfall. This is the landscape of a beginning, not a grand beginning, not the beginning of marble and ceremony, but the beginning of red clay and wood smoke and the particular quality of a Virginia winter morning when the world is quiet and the river moves past without comment. The seasons turn slowly at Ferry Farm, and each one carries its own sensory character. Spring arrives along the Rappahannock with the flooding of the lower fields, the river rising into the red clay banks, spreading across the bottomland in a sheet of brown water that catches the light and holds it. The smell of turned earth follows the flood's retreat, that particular richness of Virginia soil opened for the first time in a new planting season. The tobacco seedlings set out in careful rows across the red clay ground. Summer thickens the air with humidity, the tree line along the river shimmering in afternoon heat, the sound of cicadas rising and falling in waves from the surrounding woodland. The Rappahannock runs lower in summer, its surface slower, the smooth stones of its bed visible in the shallows near the ferry crossing, the water warm enough by August to carry the smell of the river itself, a green mineral smell, ancient and clean. Autumn brings the harvest and the first cool nights, the smell of wood smoke returning to the air as the evening temperatures drop, the fence posts silvering again with morning frost. The tobacco leaves are stripped and hung in the curing barn, their smell drifting across the farm in the still October air. The forest along the river turns in its own time, the oaks holding their color longest, the maples going first in brilliant brief flame, the whole tree line shifting from green to gold to the bare grey of November in a progression as reliable as the river's own movement. On the windowsill of the main house, a worn surveying compass rests in a patch of afternoon light. Its brass casing has been handled many times, its needle settling always to the same patient north. Beside it on the rough wooden table, rolled parchment maps lie in loose cylinders, their edges curling slightly in the dry air near the fire. A mathematics primer sits open on a chair, its spine cracked from use, its pages marked with the careful notations of a student working through problems with deliberate attention. These objects speak quietly of a mind being formed, not yet directed toward any particular destiny, but already drawn toward precision, toward the measured world, toward the satisfaction of knowing exactly where one stands in relation to the surrounding landscape. The years at Ferry Farm move in their seasonal cycles, each one building the world that would shape whatever came after. The river is always present, audible from the house on quiet mornings, visible from the upper fields, its crossing a daily fact of life for a farm that took its name from the ferry that operated there. The Rappahannock is not a dramatic river, it does not roar or rush. It moves with the same unhurried steadiness that characterizes everything about this landscape, this season, this beginning. In 1743, the atmosphere of Ferry Farm shifts in a way that the seasons alone cannot account for. The fire in the main room burns at the same level it always has, The river continues its passage, the fields await their spring planting. But the house carries a different quality of quiet, the particular silence of a space that has absorbed a loss and not yet found its new arrangement. Augustine Washington's death leaves the farm to his widow Mary and her children, the eldest of whom is 11 years old, already tall for his age, already possessed of a seriousness that sits naturally on his features. The farm continues, the river continues, the world does not pause for private grief, and the red clay shore offers no commentary on what has changed. The years that follow are years of gradual expansion. The ferry crossing at the bottom of the farm becomes a threshold crossed with increasing frequency. The far bank of the Rappahannock no longer the edge of the known world, but the beginning of a larger one. The dirt roads of Stafford County lead outward toward the estates of neighboring families, the Fairfaxes at Belvoir, the great houses along the river above and below, the wider world of colonial Virginia with its hierarchies and its ambitions, and its carefully maintained sense of order. The young Washington moves through this expanding world with the attentiveness of someone learning its rules by observation, noting the way larger estates are arranged, the way their fields are managed, the way their owners carry themselves in the company of others. A surveying chain lies coiled in the corner of the study, its iron links worn smooth from use. The instruments of measurement, compass, chain, rod, are the tools of a young man learning to read the land with precision, to translate the physical world into numbers and lines on parchment. The backcountry of Virginia beyond the Blue Ridge is already present in the imagination as a place of vast, unmeasured distances, a landscape waiting to be known. The surveying instruments on the windowsill point toward it as surely as the compass needle points north. The Rappahannock runs past Ferry Farm in the last light of an autumn afternoon, its surface catching the low sun in long golden ripples that move downstream and disappear around the bend. The red clay of the bank glows in this light with a warmth that seems to come from within the earth itself, as if the soil holds the day's heat and releases it slowly into the cooling air. The bare trees along the shore stand in their patient rows, their reflections wavering in the moving water below. The wood smoke from the house chimney drifts eastward in the evening breeze, thinning as it rises, dissolving into the pale sky above the river. This is where it begins, not with a declaration or a battle or a ceremony, but with a river and a red clay shore and the slow accumulation of seasons in a modest Virginia farmhouse. The horizon beyond the Rappahannock holds nothing yet but trees and distance, and the particular quality of a Virginia sky in the last moments before dark, when the light goes amber and then rose and then the soft grey of evening, and the river carries it all downstream, unhurried, toward whatever comes next. West of the familiar red clay world of Tidewater, Virginia, beyond the rolling Piedmont with its tobacco fields and split-rail fences, the Blue Ridge Mountains rise against the sky like a wall built by the earth itself, long, continuous, hazy with distance, their ridgeline a single unbroken stroke of blue-gray against the pale Virginia horizon. From the eastern Piedmont on a clear morning, the Blue Ridge appears almost translucent, its color shifting between blue and purple and the particular gray-green of old forest, depending on the quality of the light and the season. In summer, the mountains hold their color deep into the afternoon, the haze thickening around their slopes as the heat builds, the ridgeline softening until it seems less a physical feature than a suggestion, the edge of the known world dissolving into atmosphere. In autumn, the slopes ignite briefly in color before the hardwoods go bare, and the ridge stands sharp and clear against a cold blue sky, its true distance suddenly apparent, its true scale suddenly legible. For a young man of 16 setting out from the Piedmont in the spring of 1748, the Blue Ridge represented something more than a geographical feature. It was a threshold. The world on its eastern side was mapped and measured, its farms and roads and social arrangements familiar and legible. The world on its western side was something else entirely, a vast, largely unmeasured wilderness of river valleys and forested ridges extending westward toward distances that no colonial surveyor had yet fully reckoned. The crossing of the Blue Ridge follows a narrowing of the world. The dirt tracks of the Piedmont, wide enough for wagons and comfortable with use, give way to paths that press closer between the trees. The canopy overhead thickens as the trail climbs, the light changing from the open brightness of the cleared farmland to the filtered, greenish quality of old-growth forest. The sound changes too, the distant sounds of farms and roads falling away behind, replaced by the closer sounds of the forest itself. Wind moving through the upper canopy, the creak of large trees shifting against each other, the sound of water running somewhere below in the rocky creek beds that cut through the mountain's flanks. At the crest of the ridge, where the trail breaks briefly into the open, the view westward opens without warning, the Shenandoah Valley spread below in its full extraordinary breadth, the valley floor green and fertile and enormous, the Allegheny ridges rising beyond it in successive blue waves, each one paler than the last, the whole landscape receding westward into a haze of distance that carries no visible end. It is a view that reorganizes the imagination. The world is larger than the Piedmont suggested. The distances are real. The Shenandoah Valley floor in spring carries the smell of new grass and river water and the particular richness of bottomland soil that has never been exhausted by tobacco cultivation. The Shenandoah River runs clear over its limestone bed, its water cold even in May, its banks lined with sycamores whose white upper branches catch the light above the green of the lower canopy. The surveying work that brought Washington here in 1748, working for Lord Fairfax's vast land holdings in the valley, required moving through this landscape with systematic attention, measuring and recording, translating the physical world into the precise language of chains and degrees and compass bearings. The surveying camps of these early expeditions are modest arrangements in the wilderness, a fire built against the cold of a mountain night, bedrolls spread on the ground or on rough wooden platforms, the instruments wrapped carefully against the damp. The fire at the center of such a camp casts its amber light outward into the surrounding darkness, the forest pressing close on every side, the sound of the night woods present just beyond the firelight's reach, the call of a whippoorwill from somewhere in the dark trees, the sound of the creek running over stones below the camp, the wind moving through the high canopy overhead. Beyond the Shenandoah Valley, beyond the successive Allegheny ridges, the land opens into the Ohio Valley, a world of scales so different from Tidewater, Virginia, that it requires a complete recalibration of the eye. The rivers here are not the modest tidal streams of the Chesapeake watershed, but enormous moving bodies of water, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, the Ohio itself wide and powerful, and carrying the drainage of half a continent toward the sea. The forest that covers the Ohio Valley in the early 1750s is old-growth hardwood of a kind that no longer exists in the settled eastern colonies. Trees of extraordinary girth and height, their canopy closing the sky overhead, the forest floor below them deep in centuries of accumulated leaf mold, the light filtering down in long shafts of pale green that shift slowly as the canopy moves in the wind above. The diplomatic mission of November 1753 carries Washington into this wilderness at its most austere. The Pennsylvania November is a season of bare trees and iron-gray skies, the ground hardening with the first sustained frosts, the creeks running cold and dark between banks of frozen mud. The trail northward from Wills Creek follows the ridgelines where it can, dropping into the valleys to cross the streams, the going slow and the weather deteriorating as the weeks pass. The first heavy snowfall comes without warning, the sky lowering through a gray afternoon, the temperature dropping, the first flakes appearing in the still air and thickening within hours into a sustained fall that covers the trail and the surrounding forest in a silence more complete than any that came before. Fort LeBoeuf rises from the forest floor beside French Creek in the northwestern Pennsylvania wilderness, a crude fortification of rough-hewn logs, its walls mud-chinked against the cold, its construction speaking of military necessity rather than architectural ambition. The French flag hangs from its staff in the still December air, barely moving, its colors muted in the flat winter light. Through a small window in the main building, the warm orange glow of a fireplace is visible, the only warmth in a landscape of gray and white and bare dark wood. The creek beside the fort runs black between its ice-fringed banks, the sound of its movement the only sound in the surrounding silence. The return journey from Fort LeBoeuf through the winter wilderness is a passage through a landscape stripped to its essential character, bare trees, frozen ground, gray sky, the trail barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor under its covering of snow. The Allegheny River crossing in. December ice is a study in cold and risk, the current running dark and swift beneath a surface of grinding ice floes, the far bank a dark line against the white of the snow-covered ground beyond. The spring of 1754 brings Washington back into the Ohio country under different circumstances. The forest clearing at Jumonville Glen on a May morning exists in a particular quality of early light, the mist lying in the low ground between the hemlock ridges, the clearing itself still in deep shadow, the surrounding trees standing in their patient rows, the creek running quietly below. The morning mist moves slowly through the hemlock branches, thinning as the light strengthens, the clearing emerging gradually from its grey obscurity into the pale clarity of a spring dawn. After the clearing returns to its own quiet, the mist settling again in the low ground, the hemlock standing unchanged, the creek continuing its passage over the smooth grey stones of its bed. Fort Necessity is a circle drawn in a mountain meadow, a crude stockade of split logs set upright in the ground, enclosing a space barely sufficient for the men and supplies within it. The great meadow in which it stands is surrounded on all sides by forested high ground, the meadow grass already trampled to mud by the movement of men and horses and supply wagons. The July rain that falls on Fort Necessity falls without ceasing, a steady, grey, relentless rain that turns the meadow floor to standing water, that soaks the earthworks and the log walls and the men sheltering within them, that reduces the surrounding forest to a grey curtain of falling water through which nothing is clearly visible. The meadow holds the rain in shallow pools that reflect the grey sky above, the stockade walls rising from this standing water like something half submerged, the surrounding high ground invisible in the rain and mist. The retreat from Fort Necessity follows the forest trail eastward through the July rain, the track churned to deep mud by the passage of men and equipment, the surrounding forest dripping steadily from every branch and leaf. The trail climbs through the Allegheny ridges, each one crossed with effort, the views from the crests obscured by cloud and rain. The Blue Ridge appears at last on the eastern horizon, familiar, hazy, the color of distance and of home. The forest closes behind the retreating column like water closing over a stone, the Ohio Valley wilderness resuming its own enormous silence as the last sounds of the withdrawal fade into the trees. The red clay landscape of Virginia appears again below the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge, the familiar Piedmont fields, the dirt roads connecting the farms, the smoke rising from distant chimneys into a clearing sky. The wilderness has been crossed and recrossed, its scale registered in the body and the memory. The Blue Ridge stands behind, its ridgeline unchanged against the sky, holding the western wilderness in its long blue embrace, patient and indifferent and permanent. The Monongahela River in July moves with a particular clarity, shallow over its gravel ford, the water running transparent above smooth stones of grey and amber, the current visible as a gentle distortion of the riverbed below. On a summer morning in 1755, the valley holds this river in a landscape of extraordinary stillness. The forest on both banks stands in cathedral silence, the old-growth canopy closing overhead in a vault of green so dense that the sky appears only in fragments, pale blue pieces visible between the leaves, the morning light arriving at the forest floor in long, shifting columns that move slowly as the canopy breathes in the faint summer air. This is the landscape before the axes and the wagon wheels and the smell of fresh-cut timber that preceded General Edward Braddock's army through the Pennsylvania wilderness like a slow announcement of its own arrival. The road that Braddock's force cut through the forest toward Fort Duquesne was itself an act of transformation. A wound opened in the old-growth woodland that stretched for miles, the stumps of felled trees still pale and raw on either side of the churned track, the smell of pine resin and turned earth hanging in the summer air with an intensity that the undisturbed forest never carries. Fresh-cut timber releases something into the air around it, a sharp green smell that mingles with the darker smell of disturbed soil and the particular dustiness of a road made by many boots and iron-rimmed wheels pressing through dry summer ground. The column that moved along this road left behind it a corridor of altered landscape, the canopy broken, the light suddenly harsh and direct where it had always been filtered and gentle, the forest floor exposed and trampled where it had lain in deep shadow for centuries. The ford of the Monongahela on the 9th of July was crossed in the morning light, the army moving through the shallow water in good order. The gravel bottom firm beneath the wheels and hooves, the river running clear and cool around the legs of men and horses alike. The forest on the far bank received the column into its shadow, the road narrowing as it climbed away from the river, the canopy closing overhead once more. What the forest returned to in the hours after is a landscape of altered quiet. The road that Braddock's army had made through the wilderness now told a different story in the objects left along it. Wagons tilted at angles in the mud of the track's edges, their canvas covers torn, their contents scattered across the churned ground. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the hemlock branches from somewhere ahead, thin and persistent, mixing with the pine resin and the river smell that still hung in the valley air. The forest itself was unchanged. The old trees standing in their patient rows on either side of the road, their roots undisturbed below the surface, their canopy resuming its ordinary conversation with the wind above. Only the road between them carried the evidence of what had passed through, and the forest was already beginning, in its slow way, to reclaim the edges of that corridor, the undergrowth pressing back toward the churned center from both sides. The aftermath settled into the landscape the way all aftermaths do in wilderness. Gradually, the sounds returning first, then the birds, then the ordinary movement of air through leaves that had been still during the hours of noise and confusion. By evening, the Monongahela Valley held its summer quiet again, the river running over its gravel ford in the fading light, the forest standing on both banks as it had always stood, the road through it the only evidence that the world had changed. The years of frontier defense that followed Braddock's defeat are years of candlelight in an enormous darkness. The chain of small Virginia frontier forts that Washington oversaw as commander of the Virginia Regiment stretched along the western edge of settlement like a string of dim lights held against a vast and indifferent night. Each fort was a modest construction of rough-hewn logs, walls of split timber set upright in the ground, a gate of heavy planking, a parade ground of packed earth within, the whole structure small enough that the surrounding forest seemed to press against it from every side. At night, the firelight from within these forts cast a warm amber glow through the gaps in the log walls, visible from a distance as a faint warmth against the dark tree line, the only human light in miles of wilderness. Fort Cumberland on Wills Creek occupied a position of strategic importance, rendered in the physical terms of its landscape. The creek running cold and clear below the earthen ramparts, its sound audible from within the fort walls on quiet nights, the surrounding hills rising on every side in their covering of hardwood forest. The fort's interior was a crowded world of rough-built barracks and supply stores, the smell of wood smoke and tallow candles, and the particular mustiness of many men living in close quarters through long seasons. The earthen ramparts that enclosed it were not elegant military architecture but practical necessity, mounded earth faced with timber, wide enough to walk along the top, the view from their height extending over the creek and the surrounding forest to the ridgelines beyond. The seasons moved through these frontier years with the same indifference they brought to everything else. Winter locked the creek in ice and pressed the cold through every gap in the log walls. Spring thawed the ground to mud that clung to every boot and wheel. Summer brought the full weight of the forest's green abundance pressing against the cleared ground of the fort's perimeter. Autumn stripped the surrounding trees to their bare grey frameworks, opening the views to the ridgelines and making the landscape legible in a way the summer canopy prevented. The Forbes expedition of 1758 approached Fort Duquesne by a different route than Braddock's. A new road cut through the Pennsylvania wilderness from the east, the construction of Forbes Road described in the slow, deliberate progress of its making. General John Forbes chose a more northerly alignment through the mountains, and the road that resulted was built with a patience that Braddock's expedition had not possessed. The smell of pine resin and turned earth that accompanied its construction stretched for miles through the ancient forest, the sound of axes working in the timber audible from a great distance in the still autumn air. The road advanced through the wilderness at the pace of the men cutting it, a few miles each day, the forest giving way before the axes in a steady, methodical progression that had none of the urgency of Braddock's earlier push. The Pennsylvania autumn through which Forbes Road was cut carried its own particular beauty, the hardwood forest in its full color, the maples and oaks and chestnuts turning in succession across the ridgelines, the light of October afternoons falling golden and low through the colored canopy onto the raw new road below. The smell of fallen leaves mixed with the pine resin and the turned earth, a complex autumn smell that the men working along the road would carry in their memories long after the campaign was finished. Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio was found in ruins when the Forbes expedition arrived in November 1758. The French had withdrawn and destroyed their fortification before the British column reached it, and what remained was a landscape of recent burning, the charred timber of the fort's walls still smoking in the cold November air, the smell of ash and wet burnt wood drifting across the point of land where the two rivers met. The Allegheny came in from the northeast, running dark and cold in the November light. The Monongahela arrived from the southeast, its familiar gravel shallows now grey and still in the late season. At their confluence, the Ohio began wide and slow, and moving westward into a distance that the forest closed off from view within a mile of the forks, the river disappearing around a bend into the trees, as if it had somewhere important to go and no reason to explain itself. The forest on every horizon stood unchanged. The rivers ran as they had always run. The ruins of the French fortifications smoked quietly in the cold air, and the two great rivers met in their ordinary silence, indifferent to the human events that had been conducted on the small point of land between them. The return journey eastward through the mountains followed the new Forbes road back through the Pennsylvania wilderness, the autumn color already fading from the ridgelines, the hardwoods going bare in the November cold, the road itself now a familiar corridor through the forest rather than a fresh wound in the landscape. The Allegheny ridges were crossed one by one, each crest offering its view of the successive ranges to the east, each descent into a valley bringing the smell of the creek at its bottom and the particular cold that settled in low ground after dark. The Blue Ridge appeared on the eastern horizon in the way it always appeared, gradually, its blue line resolving out of the general haze of distance, becoming more distinct as the miles decreased, the familiar color of it carrying something that the Pennsylvania wilderness, for all its grandeur, had never offered. The red clay landscape of Virginia waited below the eastern slope, its fields and farms and dirt roads arranged in their familiar patterns, the Potomac visible in the distance as a silver line moving through the lowland. The wilderness receded behind the returning column like a tide going out, the forest closing over the road as the settlements thickened and the cleared fields widened, and the particular quality of the Virginia landscape reasserted itself around the traveler like a memory becoming present again. The Potomac River at Mount Vernon runs wide enough that the Maryland shore appears as a dark line of trees against the sky rather than a distinct and readable landscape. A presence felt more than seen, a boundary that defines the river's far edge without demanding attention. On a January morning in 1759, the river carries the color of hammered silver, its surface moving in slow, broad patterns that catch the low winter light and release it in long, shifting reflections. The water moves without urgency past the sloping lawn of the estate, past the clay bank at the river's edge, past the bare winter trees that line the shore on both sides, carrying its ordinary cargo of light and cold air southward toward the Chesapeake. Above the lawn, visible from the river as a white form set against the winter sky, the mansion of Mount Vernon stands in its composed and particular beauty. The house that Washington returned to in 1759, newly married, newly resigned from military service, the wilderness campaigns of the Ohio Valley receding into memory, was not yet the house that history would come to know. It was a more modest structure, a story and a half of wood frame construction, its white-painted exterior catching the winter light with a quiet luminosity. The work of expansion and improvement that would occupy the next 16 years was already forming in the mind of its new master. The house understood not as a finished thing, but as a project, a landscape and a structure to be shaped with the same deliberate attention that a surveyor brings to unmeasured ground. The approach to Mount Vernon from the river reveals the estate in its most composed aspect. The lawn slopes upward from the bank in a long, gentle grade, the grass in winter a pale gold-brown that catches the low light and holds it warmly. The gravel drive curves through this lawn in a graceful arc, its pale surface a gentle contrast to the surrounding turf. The mansion at the top of the slope presents its river-facing facade, the colonnaded piazza that runs the full length of the house, its white columns standing in their measured row, the roof of the piazza casting a band of shadow across the wide boards of the floor within. From the river, this piazza appears as a sheltered gallery suspended between the house and the sky, a space designed for the particular pleasure of watching the Potomac move through its daily changes of light and weather. The interior of Mount Vernon is a world of warm surfaces and careful proportion. The wide plank hardwood floors of the central passage catch the afternoon light from the tall windows at either end, the grain of the wood visible in the raking light as a subtle topography of growth and time. Persian rugs in the parlor hold their colors in the firelight, deep reds and blues that seem to deepen as the day fades and the candles are lit, the patterns of the weave becoming more intricate as the light grows warmer and more concentrated. The dining room fireplace is framed in Georgian marble of pale grey-white, its mantelpiece carved with the restrained elegance of the period, the fire within it burning in the particular way of a well-laid fire in a room designed to receive it, the flames steady and generous, the heat radiating outward into the room with a warmth that reaches every corner. The tall windows of the main rooms cast long rectangles of gold across the polished floors in the afternoon hours, the light moving slowly across the room as the sun descends toward the Maryland shore. By 4 o'clock in winter, these rectangles have stretched to their full length and begun to fade, the quality of the light shifting from gold to amber to the soft rose of a winter sunset, the room warming in color even as it cools in temperature. The private study is a room of particular intimacy. The leather-bound volumes on its shelves carry the patina of regular handling, their spines worn at the top where they have been pulled from the shelf, their covers softened by years of contact with hands that reached for them in the evening hours. The rolled maps on the desk are the maps of a man who thinks spatially, who understands the world in terms of its physical arrangement. The surveys of the Mount Vernon farms, the broader maps of the Potomac Valley, the charts of the Western Territories that remain in the imagination even after the campaigns that produced them are finished. A half-written letter on the writing surface catches the afternoon light, the ink still holding its dark intensity against the cream of the paper, the quill resting in its holder beside the silver inkstand. A candle burned low in its silver holder has left a ring of hardened wax on the desk's surface, evidence of an evening's work continued past the natural light. Outside the mansion, the 4 farms of the Mount Vernon estate extend across the landscape in their seasonal cycles. Spring plowing opens the red Virginia soil in long furrows that catch the morning light along their turned edges, the smell of the earth released by the plow blades carrying across the fields in the cool April air. The green surge of wheat and corn through May and June transforms the brown fields into a landscape of movement, the crops responding to every breeze in long, slow waves that travel across the field from one edge to the other. Summer afternoons bring the full weight of the Potomac Valley's humidity, the air thick and warm, the smell of growing things at its most concentrated, the river below the lawn shimmering in the heat. The formal gardens behind the mansion are described in their summer fullness with the attention they deserve. The geometric beds are laid out with the precision of a surveyor's plan, each bed defined by its brick edging, its interior planted in the careful arrangements of an 18th-century kitchen and pleasure garden. The herbs release their fragrance into the warm afternoon air at the slightest contact, the sharp green smell of boxwood hedging that defines the garden's structure, the deeper fragrance of lavender and rosemary in the herb beds, the sweeter smell of the flowering plants in the ornamental sections. The brick pathways between the beds hold the day's warmth into the evening, their surfaces warm to the touch long after the air has cooled, the moss growing in the joints between the bricks, a soft grey-green that darkens with the evening dew. The kitchen garden beyond the formal beds is a place of productive abundance in summer, the vegetable beds heavy with their crops, the espaliered fruit trees against the south-facing wall covered in ripening fruit, the whole enclosed space carrying the particular smell of a garden at its peak, a complex mixture of soil and growth and the warm sweetness of ripening things. The full landscape of Mount Vernon must be understood honestly, and the narrator holds this understanding with quiet gravity. The smokehouse stands near the kitchen, its interior dark and fragrant with cured meat. The spinning house is a place of constant work, its looms and wheels in continuous motion through the daylight hours. The blacksmith's forge sends its particular smell of hot iron and coal smoke across the yard on working days, the sound of the hammer on the anvil carrying across the estate in the still morning air. The quarters where the enslaved men and women who made this landscape possible lived their constrained lives stand at the edges of the working farm, modest structures of wood and clay, their interiors small and simply furnished, their occupants moving through the same beautiful landscape that the mansion overlooks, but moving through it under conditions of compelled labor and denied freedom that no amount of pastoral beauty can soften or excuse. The agricultural machinery of Mount Vernon, the ploughing and planting and harvesting, the spinning and weaving and smithing, the cooking and cleaning and building, was powered by the lives of people who had no choice in the matter, and the landscape that resulted from their labor was simultaneously one of the most beautiful estates in colonial Virginia and a place of profound moral weight. The narrator acknowledges this without deflection, holding both truths in the same quiet attention. The Potomac moves past all of it with its customary indifference, past the mansion and the formal gardens and the working farms and the quarters, past the lawn and the clay bank and the bare winter trees, carrying the light of each season on its surface and releasing it downstream. The years between 1759 and 1775 pass in their seasonal cycles, each one building the estate and the life it contains toward a fullness that feels, in the middle years, like something that might continue indefinitely. The gristmill on Dog Creek turns in its creek, the fishing operations on the Potomac bring their seasonal harvests, the experimental crops, wheat replacing tobacco as the estate's primary product, change the character of the fields and the rhythms of the farming year. Visitors arrive along the river road and depart again, leaving the estate to its ordinary quiet, but the newspapers that arrive by post rider carry a different kind of weather. The Stamp Act, the townshend duties, the reports from Boston of soldiers quartered in private homes and customs officials empowered beyond their proper authority. These arrive in the study at Mount Vernon and are read by candlelight with the same careful attention given to the agricultural reports and the surveying accounts. The atmosphere of the estate shifts in ways that are subtle but accumulating. The horizon beyond the Potomac, which has always carried the simple beauty of the Maryland shore and the changing sky, begins to carry something else, a distant suggestion of change moving closer across the water, arriving with each post rider, each newspaper, each letter from correspondents in Williamsburg and Philadelphia and Boston who are watching the same horizon and reading it the same way. The formal gardens continue their seasonal cycles. The Potomac continues its passage. The candle in the study burns low in its silver holder, the half-written letter on the desk waiting for the morning and whatever the morning will require. A city holds its breath differently than a countryside does. Philadelphia in the summer of 1775 breathes with the particular tension of a place that understands, in its bones and its cobblestones and its red brick facades, that something irreversible is being decided within its walls. The cobblestones of Philadelphia's streets in July carry the heat of the day long into the evening, their rounded surfaces warm underfoot, the gaps between them collecting the dust and hay and horse dung of a city that moves on animal power. The smell of the city in summer is layered and complex, the sharp smell of horse and stable mixing with the sweeter smell of bakery smoke from the ovens that work through the early morning hours, the salt and tar smell of the harbor drifting inland on the river breeze, the smell of old wood and candle wax emanating from every doorway of every public building along Chestnut Street. The harbor to the south is crowded with merchant vessels, their masts rising in a dense forest above the waterline, their hulls dark against the Delaware's surface, the river itself running wide and brown in the summer heat, carrying the commerce of a continent toward the sea. The red brick facades of Philadelphia's Georgian buildings line the streets in their composed and orderly rows, their white-painted window surrounds and door frames standing out against the warm red of the brick, with a crispness that speaks of civic pride and careful maintenance. The city is the largest in the colonies, a place of printers and merchants and lawyers and craftsmen, its grid of streets laid out with the rational precision of William Penn's original vision, its public buildings among the finest in North America. Independence Hall stands on Chestnut Street with the quiet authority of a building that knows its own importance. Its red brick exterior is rendered in careful architectural detail, the central pavilion rising above the flanking wings, the white Georgian steeple ascending from the roofline in its elegant tiers, the clock face visible from the street below, the whole composition balanced and serene in the summer light. The steeple catches the afternoon sun on its white-painted surfaces and holds it with a luminosity that makes it visible from a considerable distance, a landmark in the city's skyline that draws the eye upward from the street-level world of commerce and movement. The interior assembly room, where the Second Continental Congress gathered in the summer of 1775, is a space of formal beauty and practical arrangement. The tall windows along the south wall admit the afternoon light in long, warm rectangles that fall across the aged wood of the floor, the grain of the boards visible in the raking light as a record of the tree's long growth. Windsor chairs are arranged around the long tables in careful rows, their dark wood gleaming in the mixed light of windows and candles. Their simple, elegant lines the product of a craft tradition that valued function and proportion equally. Silver inkstands sit at intervals along the tables, the quill pens resting in their holders, the paper stacked in neat piles beside them. Maps of the colonies are spread across the reference tables along the walls, their edges weighted with small objects, their surfaces showing the geography of a conflict that is no longer theoretical. The commission that left this room in the hands of a tall Virginia planter in June 1775 was carried northward through the summer heat of the mid-Atlantic coast, through the New Jersey lowlands and across the Hudson River and into the Massachusetts countryside, toward a situation that required exactly the qualities that the room's occupants had, after careful deliberation, decided this particular man possessed. Cambridge, Massachusetts in July 1775 is a town transformed by the presence of an army. Harvard Yard, which in ordinary times is a quiet enclosure of brick buildings and elm trees arranged around a central green, has become a military encampment, the green itself churned by the movement of men and equipment, the elm trees providing shade for soldiers who sleep beneath them in the summer heat, the brick buildings of the college pressed into service as barracks and storehouses and offices. The smell of the yard in this season is the smell of a camp, wood smoke and unwashed wool and horse, and the particular smell of many men living in close proximity to one another in warm weather. The Longfellow House on Brattle Street serves as headquarters, a Georgian mansion of yellow-painted wood, its formal rooms now hung with maps and stacked with dispatches and correspondence, the writing tables covered with the paperwork of an army being organized from nothing. The house's tall windows look out over the street and the surrounding gardens with the same composed expression they have always worn, the exterior unchanged by the activity within, the garden behind the house continuing its summer growth with the indifference of growing things to human events. Inside, the candlelight burns late into the summer evenings, the maps on the walls showing the positions of the British forces in Boston and the American lines surrounding them, the dispatches arriving and departing through the long working days. The siege of Boston is a landscape of earthworks and cold air, and the particular quality of light that belongs to the Massachusetts coast in winter. Dorchester Heights in the cold March air of 1776 rises above the harbor in a position of commanding strategic clarity, the high ground looking down over the town of Boston and the harbor beyond, the water visible below in its full extent, the British fleet riding at anchor as dark shapes against the grey surface of the bay. The earthworks that appeared on these heights in the night of March 4th and 5th were constructed with a speed that the British commanders found, in the morning light, almost impossible to credit. The frozen ground worked through the night hours, the fortifications rising from the hillside in the darkness, the harbor below carrying no sound of the work being done above it. The earthworks themselves are raw wounds in the frozen hillside, the dark soil turned up against the pale frost of the surrounding ground, the timber reinforcements visible along the parapet's face, the whole construction speaking of urgent necessity and considerable physical effort. From below, from the harbor, these fortifications on the heights would have appeared in the morning light as a new feature of the landscape, something that had not been there the evening before, something that changed the strategic calculation of every ship in the harbor. Below, the harbor empties in the days that follow. The British fleet, those dark shapes against the grey water, begins its movement outward, the ships working their way through the harbor channels toward the open sea, their departure leaving the water below the heights progressively emptier, the wharves of Boston emerging from their long occupation into the pale March light. The smell of salt air and wood smoke drifts over the empty wharves as the last vessels clear the harbor mouth, the town of Boston standing quiet in the cold air, its streets resuming their ordinary character after months of military occupation. New York in the summer of 1776 presents a different kind of harbor entirely. The British fleet that assembled in the waters around Staten Island and in the lower bay represents a concentration of naval power without precedent in the Western Hemisphere. The masts of the warships and transports rising from the water in a forest so dense that the horizon itself seems to have been replaced by timber and canvas. The white sails of the warships catch the summer wind with a beauty that is entirely indifferent to the threat they represent. The great ships moving through the harbor approaches with the slow, deliberate grace of very large things in their proper element. The summer light on the water around them is brilliant and clear, the harbor's surface broken into 1,000 points of reflected light by the wind and the movement of so many hulls. Long Island before the Battle of late August 1776 is a landscape of quiet Dutch farmsteads and apple orchards arranged across the island's interior. The farmhouses low and solid, their stone construction speaking of permanence and agricultural patience, the orchards heavy with the summer's developing fruit, the fields between them green and orderly in the August heat. The roads of the island's interior are dirt tracks shaded by old trees, their surfaces dry and pale in the summer drought, the surrounding fields carrying the smell of warm grain and dry grass. The fog that rolled in from the harbor on the night of the retreat, the night of August 29th, arrived as a gift of the particular kind that has no explanation beyond the weather's own indifference to human plans. The East River running dark and swift below the Brooklyn Heights carried the retreating army across its width in the darkness and the fog, the boats moving back and forth through the night hours, the water black and cold around their hulls, the fog pressing close on every side so that the far shore was invisible until the bow was nearly upon it. The Manhattan Bank received the crossing army into its own darkness, the fog holding until the last boats had made their passage, the river running on beneath it as it always ran, carrying the tide toward the sea. The retreat across New Jersey follows the roads of late autumn through a landscape stripped of its summer abundance. The trees along the road stand bare against gray skies, their fallen leaves covering the road surface in a wet, dark layer that the passage of many boots and wheels reduces to mud. The farms along the route show the evidence of a season's end, the fields harvested and bare, the kitchen gardens cleared, the orchards stripped of their fruit. The cold that settles into the landscape in November carries a particular quality of gray and brown and bare wood that has no warmth in it, the sky pressing down without color over the flat New Jersey countryside. The Delaware River appears at last through the bare trees of the western bank, wide and dark, and moving with the deliberate authority of a river that knows its own importance in the geography of the moment. The Pennsylvania shore on the far side is a dark line of trees against the pale sky, close enough to be distinct, far enough to represent a boundary between what has been and what might yet be possible. The river carries its November current between the two shores with the same unhurried movement it has always carried, indifferent to the exhausted army gathering on its eastern bank, indifferent to the season and the cold and the particular weight of the moment, moving always southward, always toward the sea, as rivers do. The Delaware River on the night of December 25, 1776, is not the river of summer afternoons and silver morning light. It is something altogether different, a river transformed by winter into a landscape of darkness and grinding force, its surface broken by ice flows that move with the current in slow, massive collision, the sound of their contact a deep, irregular percussion that carries across the water and into the cold air above it. McConkey's ferry on the Pennsylvania shore sits in darkness. The sleet arrives from the northeast in long, nearly horizontal lines, visible only where it catches the faint light of the lanterns held at the water's edge, each flake a brief silver point appearing and vanishing in the moving air, the whole mass of it a curtain of cold that presses against every surface it encounters. The river below the ferry landing runs black between its ice-fringed banks, the main channel churning with the movement of flows that have broken from the upper river and are making their slow, grinding passage downstream. These flows are not thin sheets of new ice, but substantial bodies, thick, grey-white masses of river ice that carry the weight of weeks of hard cold within them, their edges worn and fractured from their collisions with each other and with the stone and timber piers of the ferry crossing. The Durham boats drawn up on the Pennsylvania bank are long, dark shapes against the pale snow of the shore flat-bottomed river craft designed for the freight trade of the Delaware Valley, their high sides and shallow draft suited to the river's ordinary moods, but tested severely by what the river has become tonight. The boatmen who will work these vessels through the ice know the river in all its characters, and they know this character as the most demanding of all, the ice flows requiring constant attention, the poles and oars working without pause to fend off the larger masses that could stove a hull or pin a boat against the bank. The ice itself deserves the narrator's full attention, for it is the central character of this night. River ice in a hard winter develops its own complex structure, the shore ice that forms first along the banks in the still water of the shallows, building outward from the edges in thin, transparent sheets that thicken with each cold night. Then the anchor ice that forms on the river bottom in the coldest stretches, rising to the surface in grey-white masses. Then the floe ice that breaks from the upper river and travels downstream. These are the pieces that make the crossing treacherous, their movement unpredictable, their edges sharp and their mass sufficient to do serious damage to anything in their path. The sound they make against each other is a sound unlike any other in the natural world, a deep, slow grinding punctuated by the crack of fracturing ice and the hollow boom of large masses meeting in the dark water. Between these sounds, the sleet hisses against the river's surface and against the wooden hulls of the boats and against the frozen ground of the Pennsylvania shore. The crossing occupies the night hours in their full cold length. The boats move back and forth through the darkness, each passage a negotiation with the ice and the current and the wind. The lanterns at the bow casting their small circles of amber light onto the black water immediately ahead, while the darkness beyond remains absolute. The New Jersey shore receives each boatload into its own darkness and cold, the men forming up on the bank and moving away from the river into the frozen countryside, their breath visible in the lantern light as brief clouds that the wind immediately disperses. The Trenton landscape at dawn on December 26th arrives in the grey light of a winter morning after storm. The sleet has shifted to snow during the night hours, and the town emerges from the darkness into a world of white and grey, the streets covered in a smooth layer of new snow, the rooftops white, the bare trees along the roads carrying their burden of accumulated ice and snow on every branch and twig. The Hessian encampment in and around the town is visible through its environmental evidence, the marks of recent occupation in the trampled snow of the streets, the smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as the morning advances, the particular quiet of a place that has not yet registered the change in its circumstances. The creek that runs through the town carries its cold water between banks of snow-covered ice, the sound of it the only moving sound in the still morning air. Princeton presents itself differently, a college town in the particular beauty of a New Jersey winter morning. Nassau Hall rises above the bare trees of the campus with the solid dignity of its stone construction, its Georgian facade catching the low morning light of early January on its pale surface. The surrounding fields are white with snow, the tree lines at their edges dark against the brightness, the whole landscape rendered in the high contrast palette of winter sunlight on fresh snow. The morning light comes in low from the southeast, casting long blue shadows from every tree and fence post across the white ground, the shadows moving almost imperceptibly as the sun climbs. The winter encampment at Morristown follows the battles of this extraordinary fortnight, the army dispersed through the town and its surrounding hills in farmhouses and crude shelters, the Presbyterian church at the center of the town serving as a landmark around which the winter life of the encampment organizes itself. The New Jersey hills in January hold their snow through the cold weeks, the landscape locked in the particular stillness of deep winter, the bare hardwoods standing on the hillsides in their grey-brown thousands, the fields between the farms smooth and white, the roads packed to ice by the passage of supply wagons and men. The farmhouses that shelter the soldiers through these months show their occupation in the smoke rising from every chimney, the woodpiles diminishing steadily against the cold, the paths between buildings packed to hard ice by constant use. The weeks of winter pass in their slow succession. The cold that settled over New Jersey in December holds through January and into February, the snow accumulating on the hillsides and in the sheltered valleys, the frozen ground resisting every attempt to work it. The supply situation that occupies the encampment's administration is conveyed through the environmental evidence of its difficulty. The empty wagons arriving from the commissary roads, the woodpiles that require constant replenishment, the particular quality of cold that penetrates even well-constructed shelters when the temperature drops below a certain threshold and stays there for days at a time. Spring arrives in New Jersey with the gradual, almost reluctant quality that characterizes the season in the mid-Atlantic, Not a sudden warming, but a slow loosening of winter's hold, the south-facing slopes losing their snow first, while the north-facing hillsides hold their white covering for weeks longer. The creeks begin to run again beneath their ice, the sound of moving water returning to the landscape after the long silence of the frozen months. The Delaware, visible to the west, runs clear and free of ice in the March light, its surface moving with the easy confidence of a river returned to its natural state after the extraordinary demands of the winter. The fields of New Jersey in early spring carry the particular color of the season's transition, the dead grass of the previous year still visible beneath the retreating snow, pale gold and brown against the gray of the soil, the first green not yet apparent but present in the swelling of the tree buds along the creek banks, and the faint greening of the south-facing slopes where the sun reaches longest. The smell of the thawing ground returns to the air, that deep mineral richness of soil released from frost, carrying the promise of the growing season in its complexity. The crisis that the winter carried has passed with the winter itself, leaving the landscape to its ordinary spring business of thawing and greening and the slow return of warmth to the cold ground. The Delaware runs southward past its Pennsylvania and New Jersey banks, clear and unhurried, carrying the snowmelt of the season toward the bay, its surface catching the March light and releasing it in the long, easy ripples of a river at peace with its own movement. There are places where the land itself seems to remember what happened within it, where the quality of light on a winter hillside, or the particular silence of a frozen valley floor, carries something beyond the ordinary weight of cold and season. Valley Forge in December is such a place. The approach from the southeast follows the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania through a landscape that has been stripped by autumn to its essential structure. The fields on either side of the road are bare, the harvest long finished, the stalks cut to stubble, the soil dark and frozen in the December cold. The farmsteads along the route sit quiet in the grey afternoon light, their woodpiles stacked high against the coming months, their kitchen gardens cleared and dormant, the bare fruit trees in their orchards standing in the still air with the patient resignation of things that have endured many winters and expect to endure many more. The sky above this landscape is the particular flat grey of an impending Pennsylvania winter, not the dramatic grey of an approaching storm, but the settled, permanent grey of a sky that has decided on its colour for the season and intends to keep it. The Schuylkill River appears through the bare trees of its bank as a dark presence moving between shores of frozen mud. The water runs cold and deliberate in the December light, its surface carrying the sky's grey reflection in long, slow patterns that shift as the current moves beneath them. The sycamores and willows along the bank stand in their winter bareness, their pale upper branches catching what light the grey sky offers and holding it in a faint luminosity, the white bark of the sycamores particularly visible against the dark of the surrounding woodland, their branches reaching outward over the water in the graceful, irregular patterns of trees that have grown toward light across many seasons. The willows trail their bare whips toward the water's surface, their tips brushing the current in the places where the bank is low, leaving faint lines in the moving water that close immediately behind them. The valley itself opens beyond the river crossing, a broad, shallow basin. Enclosed by wooded ridges on the north and south, the valley floor extending westward in its winter bareness, the creek that gives the place its name running through the low ground in a thin, dark line. In ordinary times, this would be a landscape of quiet agricultural beauty, the kind of southeastern Pennsylvania countryside that the German and Welsh settlers of the region had shaped over decades into a productive and orderly world of farms and mills and small communities. In December of 1777, it is something else. The encampment that Washington ordered constructed in this valley was built to specifications that balanced military necessity against the survival requirements of 11,000 men facing a Pennsylvania winter without adequate supplies. The huts rose from the valley floor and the surrounding hillsides in their hundreds through the last weeks of December, 14 feet by 16 feet, housing 12 men each, their construction proceeding from the first felled trees to the finished structures with the methodical urgency of men who understood that the alternative to building was freezing. The trees came down from the surrounding hillsides in a steady progression, the sound of axes working in the forest audible across the valley from first light to last, the smell of fresh-cut timber joining the wood smoke that began to accumulate in the valley air as the first fires were lit in the first completed huts. The finished huts are modest structures of necessity rather than comfort. Their walls of notched logs, chinked with clay and straw where available, provide a barrier against the wind that is more psychological than thermal in the coldest weeks. The wooden chimneys, built of wood lined with clay in the absence of stone, draw imperfectly, filling the interiors with wood smoke that settles at eye level and gives every hut its particular grey interior atmosphere. The roofs of split timber and earth shed rain and moderate snow but conduct the cold with complete indifference. The floors are bare ground, packed hard by the passage of many boots, cold as the frozen earth outside. The fireplace at one end of each hut burns through the night hours, consuming wood at a rate that the surrounding forest can barely sustain, the amber light of the fire visible through the gaps in the log walls as a faint warmth against the darkness of the valley. From the high ground above the encampment, the valley in deep winter presents a particular visual character. The rows of huts extend across the valley floor and up the hillsides in their ordered lines, their rooftops white with snow, the smoke from their chimneys rising in hundreds of thin columns that merge in the still air above the valley into a single grey haze that hangs over the encampment like a low cloud. The snow that fell in January and did not melt covers everything: the parade ground, the supply roads, the hillsides visible in every direction, the frozen creek in the valley bottom. The bare ridges above the encampment stand against the flat grey sky with a clarity that the summer canopy would prevent, every tree on their slopes individually visible, the whole landscape legible in a way that offers no comfort and no concealment. The sensory world of Valley Forge in its deepest winter months is built from a small number of repeated elements. The smell of wood smoke is constant and pervasive. It saturates the clothing and the hair of every person in the encampment. It settles into the fabric of the hut walls. It drifts across the parade ground and the supply roads and the hospital area in a thin, persistent haze that the wind occasionally disperses before it reforms. The sound of axes working in the forest continues through the daylight hours, the steady rhythm of the cutting, the pause, the crack of a falling tree, the silence before the next stroke begins. The particular silence of the encampment in deep cold is different from ordinary quiet. It is a silence with weight in it, the silence of men conserving warmth and energy, of an army reduced to its essential endurance. The hospital huts stand apart from the main encampment in the low ground near the creek. They are described only through their exterior, the smoke rising from their chimneys in the same thin columns as the other huts, the snow trampled around their entrances by the passage of those who tend them, the low firelight visible through their small windows in the evening hours. They are places of shadow and careful attention, their presence in the valley acknowledged with the quiet gravity that the documentary's tone requires, part of the full truth of this winter, held without deflection. The makeshift forge near the encampment center sends its own particular smoke into the valley air, darker and more acrid than the wood smoke of the huts, carrying the smell of hot iron and coal that is the smell of repair and persistence. Weapons are brought here and returned to service. The forge fire burns with a different quality of light than the hut fires, hotter and more concentrated, its orange intensity visible from a distance in the grey winter afternoon, the hammer strokes carrying across the encampment in a rhythm that speaks of work continuing despite everything. The empty supply wagons that arrive along the roads from the south and east carry their own environmental message. The roads themselves are rutted and frozen, the wagon tracks pressed deep into the mud of earlier passages and then locked in place by the cold, the surface treacherous for horses and men alike. The wagons that arrive without the provisions the encampment requires return along these same roads with the same emptiness, their passage leaving no change in the valley's situation, the supply roads stretching away through the bare Pennsylvania countryside toward a distance that offers no immediate remedy. The headquarters at the Isaac Potts house, a stone structure near the creek, its solid construction a contrast to the log huts of the encampment, shows its occupation through the environmental evidence of continuous work. The windows glow with candlelight through the long winter evenings, the light steady and warm against the darkness outside. Maps cover the table within, their surfaces marked and remarked as the strategic situation evolves through the winter months. Letters move outward from this house along the frozen roads, to Congress, to the states, to suppliers and commanders and correspondents whose assistance is needed. and whose responses are awaited with the patience of a man who has learned to work within the constraints of what is possible. March arrives in the valley with the first signs of the season's turning. The change is not dramatic, not a sudden warmth or a decisive thaw, but a gradual loosening of winter's hold that begins in the south-facing slopes and works its way slowly across the valley floor. The snow retreats first from the sunny hillsides, revealing the dead grass of the previous year in its pale gold and brown, the soil beneath it dark and wet from the snowmelt. The creek begins to run more freely, the ice along its banks pulling back from the current, the sound of moving water returning to the valley after the long silence of the frozen months. The green shoots that appear in the valley floor in April are small and tentative at first, the first grass of the new season pushing through the dead material of the old, the buds on the trees along the creek swelling and then breaking into the pale green of new leaves. The birdsong that returns to the hillsides in these weeks is the most significant environmental change of all, the silence of the winter months broken by the ordinary voices of birds going about their spring business, indifferent to the human drama that has been conducted in the valley below them. The transformation of the encampment as spring advances is conveyed through the sounds that carry across the valley on the warming air. The drilling formations on the parade ground, the result of the systematic training that Baron Friedrich von Steuben brought to the encampment in the late winter months, produce a new kind of sound in the valley. The movement of men in coordinated formation, the commands carrying across the open ground, the rhythm of boots on the packed earth of the parade ground, these are the sounds of an army reconstituted, its disorder replaced by the precision that sustained military operations require. The fifes and drums that accompany the drilling carry their thin, bright music across the valley and up the hillsides, the sound reaching the tree line and returning as a faint echo before dissolving into the spring air. It is a sound entirely different from the sounds of the winter months, purposeful and rhythmic, carrying something in its cadence that the wood smoke and the axe strokes and the silence of deep cold did not carry. June arrives in the valley with the full warmth of a Pennsylvania summer beginning to assert itself. The huts stand in their rows with their fires cold and their doors open to the warm air, the smoke that defined the valley's winter atmosphere gone from the sky above them. The parade ground holds the marks of the season's drilling in its packed surface. The creek runs clear and easy between its banks, the sycamores in full leaf above it, the willows trailing their green whips in the current. The encampment breaks in the second week of June 1778, the army moving north and east along the roads of New Jersey toward a different season of the war. The huts are left standing, their fires cold, their interiors empty, the valley returning to its own quiet life as the last sounds of the departing army fade along the road. The Schuylkill moves past the valley mouth as it has always moved, dark and unhurried, carrying the spring runoff toward the Delaware and the sea. The bare ridges above the valley hold their tree lines against the summer sky. Valley floor, where 11,000 men endured a winter that tested the limits of human persistence, resumes its ordinary silence, the creek running, the birds calling from the hillsides, the June light warm and generous on the grass growing green and untroubled over the ground where the hut stood. The Hudson River in summer moves with a majesty that the smaller rivers of the eastern seaboard cannot match, wide and deliberate between its walls of forested rock, the water running deep and dark green in the channel, the morning mist lying in the valleys below the Palisades in long, slow-moving pools that the rising sun burns away from the edges inward, leaving the river itself the last thing to emerge from the gray into the full clarity of a summer morning. The Hudson River highlands in the summer and autumn of 1778 present this landscape in its most commanding aspect. The river narrows through the highlands, the forested ridges pressing close on both banks, the water between them running with a purposefulness that the broader reaches above and below do not possess. The rock walls of the highlands rise directly from the water in places, grey granite faces streaked with moisture, their surfaces covered in the thin soil that supports the oak and chestnut forest above them, the trees growing from every available ledge and crack with the tenacious patience of things that have learned to make do with very little. In the morning hours, when the mist still lies in the side valleys and the river surface holds the sky's early color, this landscape has a quality of primordial stillness that the presence of fortifications and encampments only partially disturbs. West Point rises from the Hudson's western bank at a bend in the river where the channel turns sharply, the high ground commanding the approach from both directions. The rocky promontory that carries the fortifications stands above the river with the natural authority of a feature that geography itself seems to have designed for military purpose. The river visible for miles in both directions from the heights, the chain stretched across the water below serving as the physical expression of the strategic control that the position commands. The chain itself, a massive construction of iron links, each one forged at the nearby furnace and assembled into a barrier that floats on log rafts across the river's width, lies just below the surface in the channel, its presence felt rather than seen, the dark water moving over and around it without acknowledgement. The fortifications carved into the hillside above the chain are described through their materials and their relationship to the landscape, the earthen ramparts following the natural contours of the rocky ground, the timber reinforcements weathered to grey in the river air, the cannon emplacements looking outward over the water with the patient attention of things that have been positioned to wait. From the heights of West Point, the view extends north and south along the river valley in a panorama of extraordinary scope, the river running between its forested ridges in both directions, the morning light catching its surface in long golden lines, the mist in the side valleys burning away as the hours advance, the whole landscape of the highlands revealing itself gradually from its morning obscurity into the full clarity of a summer afternoon. The encampments of the Middle War years returned to Morristown in the brutal winter of 1779 and 1780. And this winter surpasses even the Valley Forge winter in the severity of its demands. The New Jersey hills in January of 1780 are locked in a cold that the records of the period describe as the most extreme in living memory. The snow deeper than any previous winter, the cold more sustained, the ground frozen to a depth that makes even the construction of the crude log huts more difficult than it had been 2 years before. The landscape of this second Morristown winter is rendered in the documentary's most austere palette, the white of deep snow on every surface, the grey of the sky above it, the dark lines of the bare trees on the hillsides, the thin columns of smoke rising from the encampment into the still cold air. The Presbyterian church at the center of the town stands in this landscape as it always stands, its white painted wood catching the winter light, its steeple rising above the surrounding rooftops, the churchyard beside it deep in snow that no one has disturbed. The correspondence that flows outward from the headquarters at Morristown through these winter months travels along frozen roads through a landscape that seems indifferent to the urgency of what it carries. The letters move by rider through the New Jersey countryside, past the snow-covered farms and the bare orchards and the frozen creeks, toward Philadelphia and the Congress that Washington addresses with the measured persistence of a man who has learned to make his case without raising his voice. The letters themselves are objects of considerable physical presence, the folded sheets of paper sealed with wax, the handwriting careful and deliberate, the language precise and restrained even when the circumstances they describe are desperate. They travel through the cold and arrive at their destinations carrying the ambient temperature of the journey in their paper, the wax seal cold to the touch, the words within them warm with the urgency of what they ask. The Southern campaign is a different landscape entirely, a different American South from the Virginia and Maryland tidewater that Washington knows most intimately. The Carolina Piedmont in its autumn colors presents a landscape of tobacco fields and pine forests arranged across a terrain of gentle ridges and river valleys, the light of October falling across it with a warmth that the northern states have already lost. The rivers of the Carolina campaign, the Catawba, the Dan, the Yadkin, run between their wooded banks with the particular character of Piedmont rivers. Not the broad, tidal rivers of the coast, but quick and clear over their rocky beds, their banks lined with hardwoods that carry their autumn color into November, the water cold and swift in the shallows and dark and deep in the pools below the rapids. These rivers served as strategic boundaries in the campaign that Nathanael Greene conducted through the Carolinas in the winter and spring of 1780 and 1781, each crossing a tactical decision, each ford a point of vulnerability or opportunity depending on the season and the water level. The Dan River in February carries the snowmelt of the Virginia mountains in its current, running high and cold and fast between its banks, the crossing of it a matter of boats and urgency, and the particular quality of winter light on moving water. The landscape of the Carolina Piedmont through which this campaign moved is rendered in the documentary's environmental mode. The pine forests of the sandhills giving way to the hardwood bottomlands of the river valleys, the tobacco fields bare in winter, the farmsteads of the backcountry settlers standing in their clearings with the self-sufficient solidity of places built for permanence. The movement toward Yorktown in the autumn of 1781 is a convergence of forces across a landscape that the Chesapeake Bay dominates from the east. The bay itself is visible on the eastern horizon as a brightness, the light reflecting off its broad surface carrying inland through the flat Virginia tidewater, the smell of salt water arriving on the easterly breeze before the water itself becomes visible. The York River runs between its wooded banks with the tidal deliberateness of a river that knows the sea is close. The water brackish and dark, the banks low and marshy in places, the hardwood forest along the higher ground reflected in the river's surface in long, wavering images that the current slowly distorts and reforms. The French fleet in the Chesapeake following the Battle of the Capes is a presence felt through the stillness it imposes on the bay. The British naval force that might have relieved Yorktown has withdrawn to New York, and the bay in October 1781 belongs to the French, the ships of the Comte de Grasse riding at anchor in the lower bay, their presence making the York River and the Yorktown Peninsula a closed system from which no relief will come by water. The bay itself carries this strategic reality in its ordinary appearance, the wide water, the distant shores, the autumn sky reflected in the surface, the whole landscape of the Chesapeake going about its tidal business, as if the fleet anchored in its lower reaches were simply another feature of the geography. The siege lines at Yorktown are geometric features imposed on the Virginia landscape with the deliberate precision of military engineering. The parallel trenches advance toward the British fortifications in their calculated progression, the first parallel, then the second, each one closer to the British works, each one representing a further compression of the space available to the defenders. The construction of these trenches is a matter of earth and timber, and the particular smell of turned Virginia clay, that red-orange soil of the tidewater, rich and dense, its smell released by the spades that open it into the autumn air. The redoubts that anchor the British defensive line are earthen constructions of considerable strength, mounded soil faced with timber, their profiles low against the surrounding landscape, their interiors visible from the advancing parallels only as the distance decreases. The Virginia autumn that surrounds this siege is in its full color, the hardwoods along the York River and in the woodlands beyond the siege lines carrying their October display, the oaks holding their russet and brown against the pale blue of the autumn sky, the maples already gone to bare gray, the whole landscape in that particular state of late-season beauty that carries within it the knowledge of the cold to come. The light of October afternoons falls across the siege lines and the Virginia fields with the low, golden quality of the season, long shadows stretching eastward from every earthwork and redoubt, the light warm on the turned clay of the trenches, the sky above the whole seen a deep, clear blue that the summer's humidity has finally relinquished. October 19th arrives in this landscape as an afternoon of particular clarity. The autumn light on the Virginia fields is warm and still, the air carrying the smell of turned earth and fallen leaves and the distant salt of the Chesapeake. The British colors are cased in the formal ceremony of a surrender that ends 8 years of continental war, the flags folded into their coverings, the military band playing its appointed music somewhere beyond the immediate scene, the sound of it carrying across the fields in the still afternoon air and then fading. The York River runs quietly past the town and the siege lines and the surrendered fortifications, its tidal current moving as it has always moved, indifferent to the ceremony being conducted on its bank, carrying the afternoon light on its surface southward toward the bay and the open sea beyond. A city exhales differently than it inhales. Philadelphia in the winter of 1781 and 1782 carries in its streets and its red brick facades, and its harbor the particular quality of a place releasing a breath it has held for years. The tension of occupation and threat, and uncertain outcome slowly departing from the cobblestones and the doorframes and the cold river air, leaving behind something quieter and more considered than what came before. The streets of Philadelphia in this winter return to their commercial character with a gradual confidence. The harbor to the south fills again with merchant vessels, their masts rising above the Delaware's surface in the dense, purposeful forest of a trading port resuming its ordinary business. the ships carrying goods inward from the Atlantic and outward from the continent's interior, the wharves active with the loading and unloading that is the physical expression of a city's economic life. The smell of the harbor in winter carries tar and salt, and the particular cold of river water in December, a clean, sharp smell that mingles with the wood smoke drifting from the city's chimneys and the bakery smoke from the ovens working through the early morning hours along Market Street. The State House on Chestnut Street stands in its composed architectural dignity through these winter months, its red brick facade darkened by the season's moisture, its white Georgian steeple catching what pale light the December sky offers, and holding it with the quiet luminosity of a well-proportioned surface in diffuse winter illumination. The interior rooms where the Continental Congress continues its deliberations carry the smell of old wood and candle wax and ink that pervades every chamber where important documents are drafted. A complex layered smell that speaks of accumulated work, of many hours of careful attention conducted by candlelight in rooms that the winter cold penetrates despite the fires burning in their hearths. The Congress Hall chambers are spaces of formal arrangement and practical use, the tables covered with the papers and correspondence of a government learning its own dimensions, the Windsor chairs arranged in their careful rows, the tall windows admitting the grey winter light in long, pale rectangles across the aged floorboards. The silver inkstands sit at their intervals along the tables, the quill pens resting in their holders beside stacked pages of correspondence and resolution and debate. Maps of the new nation cover the reference tables along the walls, the 13 states rendered in their geographical reality, the western territories beyond them extending toward distances that no eastern mapmaker has yet fully reckoned, the whole enormous extent of the new republic present on paper in these rooms where its governance is being slowly, imperfectly, urgently invented. The summer of 1783 carries the Continental Congress northward from Philadelphia to Princeton, New Jersey, where Nassau Hall receives the government of a new nation into its stone-walled interior, with the equanimity of a building that has already served many purposes. The New Jersey heat of July presses through the tall windows of the hall with a persistence that the building's thick stone walls moderate, but cannot entirely prevent, the air within the chambers warm and still in the afternoon hours, carrying the smell of old stone and wood and the accumulated presence of many seasons of academic and now governmental use. The light through the tall windows falls across the working surfaces in broad, warm rectangles that shift slowly through the afternoon as the sun moves across the summer sky outside. The smell of old wood and ink and candle wax that the narrator noted in Philadelphia's chambers is present here too. It is the smell of consequential work being conducted in enclosed spaces, the smell of a government in the process of defining itself through the documents it produces and the decisions it records. Princeton in summer carries its own ambient sounds through those tall windows, the birdsong of the surrounding trees, the distant sound of the town going about its ordinary business, the occasional passage of a horse and rider along the road outside. These ordinary sounds press gently against the work being conducted within Nassau Hall, reminding the chamber of the world it governs and the world that continues regardless of what is decided within. Annapolis, Maryland in December of 1783 presents itself as a winter city of quiet elegance. The Maryland State House occupies its hilltop position above the town, with the composed authority of a building designed to be seen from the water, the distinctive dome rising above its octagonal drum, the whole structure visible from the Chesapeake Bay at the end of every street that runs downhill from the State House toward the harbor. The bay itself is present at the edge of every view in Annapolis, visible between the buildings, glimpsed at the foot of the descending streets, its gray December surface carrying the cold light of the season in long, slow patterns that shift with the wind. The smell of the Chesapeake reaches into the town on the winter breeze, salt and cold water, and the particular mineral smell of a large tidal body in its winter character. The Senate chamber within the Maryland State House is a room of formal beauty suited to the occasion it is about to receive. The ceiling rises to its full height above the polished floor, the afternoon winter light entering through the tall windows in the pale, angled quality of December illumination. Not the warm gold of summer afternoons, but a cooler, cleaner light that renders every surface with particular clarity. The floor reflects this light from its polished surface, the grain of the wood visible in the raking illumination as a subtle record of growth and time. The chairs arranged within the chamber hold their positions with the formal precision of a space prepared for ceremony, the whole room carrying in its proportions and its materials the sense of an occasion understood in advance to be significant. On December 23, 1783, this room receives the commission that was granted in Philadelphia 8 years before. The act of returning it is performed with the deliberate formality that Washington understood such moments to require, the commission presented, the words spoken, the document passing from the hands that have carried it through 8 years of war back to the civil authority that issued it. The room absorbs this act into its ordinary quiet. The afternoon light continues its slow movement across the polished floor. The tall windows hold their pale December rectangles against the walls. Outside, the streets of Annapolis carry the cold air of a December afternoon, the Chesapeake visible at the foot of the descending streets, its gray surface moving in the winter wind with the unhurried indifference of deep water. The journey home to Mount Vernon follows the roads of Maryland and Virginia through the short days of late December. The countryside along the route is in its deepest winter aspect, the fields bare and frost-silvered, the bare trees standing against pale skies, the farmsteads along the road sending their wood smoke into the still cold air. The road descends through Maryland toward the Potomac crossing, the river appearing through the bare trees of its bank as a wide, dark presence moving between its winter shores. The Virginia side receives the traveler into its familiar landscape, the red clay of the roads, the arrangement of farms and woodlands that the eye has known since childhood, the whole geography of home reasserting itself around the returning figure with the quiet certainty of a place that has been waiting. The white columns of Mount Vernon appear above the river in the last light of a December afternoon, pale against the darkening sky, the mansion set above its sloping lawn with the composed stillness of a place that has continued its own life through the years of absence. The Potomac moves past below, gray and cold and unhurried, carrying the winter light on its surface southward toward the bay. The estate receives its returning master in the January quiet of 1784, with the composed stillness of a place that has kept its own counsel through long years of absence. The Potomac running gray and cold past the lawn, the mansion standing above the river in its familiar arrangement, the bare winter trees along the shore holding their patient positions against a pale Virginia sky. Mount Vernon in the mid-1780s is a place of productive transformation, the construction and renovation that Washington had long envisioned for the estate proceeds through these years with the methodical attention of a man who has learned, through long campaigns, the value of deliberate and sustained effort applied to a fixed objective. The north and south wings taking shape at either end of the main house alter the mansion's proportions gradually, the new construction rising from its foundations through the seasons, the smell of fresh-cut timber and lime mortar joining the familiar smells of the working estate. The distinctive cupola that crowns the roofline catches the morning light from its elevated position above the house, its weather vane turning in the river breeze, its windows offering a view of the Potomac and the Maryland shore that no other point on the estate commands. The piazza extending along the river-facing facade grows to its full length through these years, the colonnade of white-painted columns standing in their measured row above the sloping lawn, the wide boards of the piazza floor warm in the afternoon sun, the view from its length encompassing the full breadth of the river and the wooded Maryland shore beyond. The agricultural operations of the estate proceed through their seasonal rhythms with the systematic attention of an owner who approaches farming with the same analytical disposition he brought to military logistics. The experimental crops that Washington attempts through these years, wheat and flax and hemp replacing the tobacco that exhausted the red Virginia soil of earlier decades, change the character of the fields and the rhythms of the farming year. The new gristmill on Dog Creek stands as the most substantial addition to the estate's productive machinery. Its construction is described in its architectural and mechanical particulars, the stone walls rising from the creek bank, the millrace directing the water's flow against the wheel itself turning in the clear water with the patient, continuous motion of a mechanism in harmony with its power source. The sound of the mill wheel carries across the surrounding fields in the still morning air, a rhythmic, watery sound that becomes part of the estate's ambient music, alongside the bird song and the river wind, and the distant sound of the Potomac moving past the lawn below. The steady stream of visitors who come to Mount Vernon through these years leaves its evidence in the environmental details of hospitality extended and received. Extra horses stand in the stable beyond the usual complement, their presence announced by the additional sounds and smells of the stable yard, the grooms moving between the stalls with the practiced efficiency of a household accustomed to accommodating guests. The long dining table in the formal room is set with additional places, the silver and china arranged with the careful precision of a household that takes its hospitality seriously, the candles in their holders casting their warm light across the polished surface and the faces gathered around it. The guest rooms are made up with fresh linen, the beds turned down, the washstands supplied, the small fires laid in the hearths against the evening chill. The formal gardens are shown in their best summer arrangement to those who walk through them in the warm afternoon hours, the geometric beds in their full seasonal display, the brick pathways warm underfoot, the smell of boxwood and lavender, and the kitchen garden's abundance carrying through the still air. The Potomac River describes the full cycle of a year through these peaceful seasons with a completeness that no other element of the landscape can match. Spring brings the floods that spread across the low meadows below the lawn, the river rising into its banks and beyond them, the bottomland disappearing beneath a sheet of brown water that catches the April light and holds it in long, trembling reflections. The smell of the flooded ground carries the rich mineral complexity of river sediment deposited across the meadow grass, the particular fertility of a landscape regularly renewed by the water that passes over it. Summer thickens the river's surface with heat shimmer, the water visible from the piazza as a broad, glittering expanse in the midday hours, the Maryland shore across it wavering in the heat haze, the whole river valley wrapped in the humid abundance of a Virginia August. Autumn brings the colors of the surrounding woodland to the river's surface, the reds and golds of the Maryland shore reflected in the current, the water carrying these colors downstream in long, distorted images that the current slowly pulls apart and reforms. Winter ice forms along the banks in the coldest weeks, the still water of the shallows freezing first, the ice building outward from the shore in thin, transparent sheets that thicken with each cold night, the main channel running dark and free between the ice-fringed banks, the sound of the current audible in the winter quiet. The study within the mansion holds the evidence of a mind engaged with the world beyond the estate's boundaries, even in these years of deliberate retirement. The correspondence that arrives by post-rider and departs again by the same means connects Mount Vernon to a wider conversation about the condition of the new republic. Letters from former officers, from political correspondents in the state capitals, from figures in Philadelphia and New York who are watching the performance of the Articles of Confederation with increasing concern. The dispatches accumulate on the writing table beside the half-finished responses, the candle burning low in its silver holder through the evening hours as the work of reading and replying continues. The maps on the walls of the study show the geography of a nation whose governance is proving more difficult than its founding documents anticipated. The 13 states in their separate sovereignties, the Western territories in their unmeasured extent, the whole enormous republic present on paper in a room where the fire burns quietly and the Potomac moves past outside in the darkness. The quiet years carry their own weight as they pass. The estate reaches toward the fullness of its intended form, the wings completed, the cupola in place, the piazza extended, the gristmill turning on Dog Creek, the experimental fields demonstrating the possibilities of a more rational agriculture. The mornings on the piazza offer the river in its daily variations of light and weather, the Maryland shore across the water holding its dark line of trees against whatever sky the season provides. The evenings in the study offer the candlelight and the correspondence and the slow accumulation of evidence that the nation's governance is faltering. The horizon beyond the Potomac begins, through 1786 and into 1787, to carry a different quality of light, not the simple beauty of the Maryland shore and the changing sky, but the reflected urgency of a republic discovering the limits of its first constitutional arrangements. The dispatches arriving along the river road carry news of Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, of interstate commerce disputes, of a Congress unable to act with the authority that the moment requires. The quiet of Mount Vernon absorbs these arrivals without drama, the post rider coming up the drive, the letters carried to the study, the fire burning in the hearth as the contents are read by candlelight. But the quality of the quiet changes with each delivery, the peaceful interlude of these years drawing toward its close, as the wider world reasserts its claim on the man who has tried, with genuine conviction, to be only a farmer on a river in Virginia. The Potomac moves past the lawn in the early months of 1787 with its customary indifference, carrying the winter light on its surface southward toward the bay. The bare trees along the shore stand in their patient rows. The cupola above the mansion turns its weathervane in the river wind. The unfinished business of a nation waits on the far side of the horizon. In the summer of 1787, 55 men gathered in a shuttered room in Philadelphia to decide whether the republic they had fought to create would survive its own contradictions, and the man who presided over them arrived carrying the weight of a reluctance that only duty had overcome. Philadelphia in May receives its delegates from every state with the particular energy of a city that understands itself to be at the center of something consequential. The streets carry their familiar summer character, the cobblestones warm underfoot by mid-morning, the smell of horse and hay and bakery smoke layered in the humid air, the harbor to the south sending its salt and tar smell inland on the river breeze. But the city in this May is additionally charged with the presence of arriving men, the boarding houses along Chestnut and Market streets filling with delegates from Georgia and New Hampshire and every state between, their horses adding to the stable yards, their correspondents adding to the post riders moving through the city's grid of streets in the early morning hours. The Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street stands in its composed red brick authority, its white Georgian steeple rising above the surrounding rooftops into the pale blue of a May morning sky. The building's facade carries the particular warmth of old brick in morning light, the surface textured and deep in color, the white painted window surrounds and door frames standing out against it with a crispness that speaks of careful maintenance. The steeple ascends from the roofline in its elegant tiers, each one smaller than the one below, the whole composition balanced and serene against the sky above the city's rooftops. The assembly room within the State House is where the convention meets through the long summer months, and it is a room that rewards the narrator's careful attention. Its tall windows along the south wall are shuttered against both the Philadelphia heat and the possibility of eavesdropping, the shutters closed to the summer street outside, the room within lit by the combined light that filters through their louvers and the candles burning at intervals along the tables. This filtered light gives the room a particular quality, warm and slightly dim, the surfaces of the furniture and the floor rendered in amber tones that the full summer light outside would resolve into something harsher and more ordinary. The green baize covering the tables absorbs the light softly, its surface carrying the silver inkstands and the quill pens and the stacked papers of a working assembly in a way that the bare wood beneath could not. The Windsor chairs arranged in their careful rows carry the same dark gleam they have always carried in this room, their simple, elegant lines unchanged from the years when other consequential decisions were made in this same space. Maps of the new nation cover the reference tables along the walls, the 13 states rendered in their geographical particulars, the Western territories extending beyond them toward unmeasured distances, the whole enormous extent of the Republic present on paper in a room where its future form is being debated. The silver inkstands sit at their intervals, the quill pens resting in their holders, the paper stacked in neat piles beside them. At the front of the room, the presiding chair occupies its elevated position, a carved wooden chair with a half-sun motif worked into its crest rail, the symbol ambiguous enough that one delegate would later remark he had wondered through the summer whether the sun was rising or setting, and had concluded at the convention's end that it was rising. The Philadelphia heat presses through the shuttered windows with a persistence that the room's interior cannot entirely resist. By afternoon, the temperature within the assembly room reaches a level that the men working there register in the loosening of their cravats and the frequency with which they reach for the water brought to the tables at intervals through the long sessions. The city outside continues its ordinary summer life. The street sounds audible through the shutters as a muffled background to the debates within, the cries of vendors and the clatter of wagon wheels, and the sound of horses on the cobblestones pressing gently against the room's formal proceedings. The smell of the city in summer penetrates even the shuttered space, the warm, complex smell of a living city in July heat, mixing with the candle wax and ink and old wood of the chamber itself. The convention occupies the room from late May through mid-September, 4 months of sustained deliberation conducted in this shuttered, candlelit space, while the summer moves through its full arc outside. The candles burn late into the summer evenings as the debates continue past the natural light, their flames steady in the still air of the closed room, the amber light they cast warming the faces of the men gathered around the green baize tables. The papers accumulate on the tables through the weeks, drafts and revisions and committee reports, the physical evidence of a document being constructed through argument and compromise, and the slow, difficult work of finding language that men of genuinely different views can accept. The completed Constitution exists first as an object before it becomes a principle. The parchment document, its surface carrying the careful script of Jacob Shallis, the Pennsylvania Assembly's clerk, holds its text in the precise, formal hand of official record. The signatures arranged at its foot follow the geographic order of the states from north to south, the names written in the varying styles of 55 men who have spent a summer in a shuttered room together and emerged with something that none of them could have produced alone. The official seal pressed into wax at the document's edge carries the weight of the authority that the convention has claimed and exercised, the warm wax receiving the impression of the seal and hardening around it, fixing the mark of the new republic's foundational law in a substance that will outlast the summer that produced it. The document moves through the streets of Philadelphia to the printer's shop, carried through the September air of a city that does not yet know what has been decided in the shuttered room on Chestnut Street, the ordinary life of the cobblestones and the harbor and the bakery smoke continuing around it. The printed copies that emerge from the press will travel outward from Philadelphia along every road of the Republic, carried by post riders through the autumn countryside toward the state conventions that will decide the document's fate. The journey home from Philadelphia follows the Pennsylvania countryside in its September color, the hardwoods beginning their turn along the ridgelines, the fields harvested and golden in the late-season light, the road south through Maryland carrying the traveler through a landscape that the summer's heat has finally relinquished. The Potomac appears through the trees of its Maryland bank, wide and silver in the September afternoon, the Virginia shore beyond it dark with its familiar tree line. Mount Vernon waits above the river in its composed arrangement, the cupola catching the late light, the piazza open to the river breeze, the lawn sloping down to the water in its pale autumn gold. The river moves past as it always moves, carrying the September light southward toward the bay, indifferent to what has been decided in the shuttered room, patient as water is patient, flowing always toward whatever comes next. The harbor of New York City in April of 1789 holds within its broad waters a quality of celebration that even the most composed observer cannot mistake for ordinary commerce. The vessels dressed in bunting and signal flags, their colors bright against the gray-blue of the upper bay, the whole waterfront transformed by the knowledge of what this particular April morning means for the fragile republic gathering itself around a single necessary act. Federal Hall on Wall Street receives the morning light on its newly renovated facade with the composed dignity of a building that has been prepared for exactly this occasion. The building's exterior carries fresh paint and new stonework, its balcony railing overlooking the street below where the crowd has gathered since the early hours, the cobblestones of Wall Street invisible beneath the press of people who have come to witness something that has never happened before and will never happen again in quite this way. The harbor beyond the rooftops of Lower Manhattan is visible from the upper stories of the surrounding buildings, its surface carrying the reflections of the decorated vessels in long, wavering lines of color that shift with the April wind on the water. The Senate chamber within Federal Hall is a room of formal proportion and careful appointment, its high ceiling rising above the assembled members, the tall windows admitting the April light in warm rectangles across the polished floor, the whole space arranged with the deliberate formality of a room that understands its own significance. The Bible brought from St. John's Lodge for the oath rests on a crimson cushion, its leather cover worn with use, its pages carrying the accumulated handling of many years of ceremony and private devotion. The balcony railing beyond the chamber's tall doors opens onto the street below, And it is here that the oath is administered in the open air, the words spoken above the crowd, the city and the harbor and the April sky present as witnesses to the founding of an executive office that has no precedent and no template. The President's House in Philadelphia, the Robert Morris Mansion on Market Street, becomes the center of executive government when the capital moves southward in 1790, and it carries this function in its formal rooms with the particular quality of a private residence adapted to public purpose. The dining room set for official state dinners presents its long table in the candlelight of formal evenings. The silver and china arranged with the precision of a household that receives the representatives of foreign nations and the members of a new government with equal attention to the protocols that such occasions require. The candles in their holders cast their warm amber light across the polished surface of the table and the faces gathered around it, the room holding its formal character through the hours of these dinners with the composed steadiness of a space designed for exactly this kind of sustained, ceremonial use. The private office where correspondence is conducted by candlelight is a different room entirely, smaller and more intimate, its surfaces covered with the papers of a government being administered from a single desk. The letters that move outward from this room travel along every road of the Republic, carried by post riders through the seasons toward the state capitals and the foreign courts, and the private correspondence whose counsel Washington seeks, and whose concerns he addresses with the measured, deliberate attention that his correspondence always reflects. The candle in its holder burns low through the evening hours, the wax pooling in its dish, the flame steady in the still air of the closed room, the scratch of the quill on paper the only sound beyond the distant noise of the Philadelphia street outside. The city of Philadelphia, as Washington's presidential world, extends outward from the President's House along its grid of streets in every direction. The State House on Chestnut Street stands within easy walking distance, its familiar red brick facade and white steeple unchanged from the summers of convention and declaration. The Delaware River is visible to the east, at the foot of the descending streets, its broad surface carrying the commerce of the continent in the vessels that move along it through every season. The city's streets in the morning hours carry their familiar mixture of horse and hay and bakery smoke, the cobblestones warm in summer and cold in winter, the red brick facades of the buildings lining them in their composed and orderly rows through every change of season and administration. The 8 years of the presidency move through the President's House and the city around it, in the cycling of seasons that marks all time in a place of fixed geography. The formal rooms shift between the elaborate preparations of state entertaining and the quieter arrangements of ordinary governmental work. The dining room set and cleared, and set again through the years, the private office accumulating and releasing its correspondence in the steady rhythm of an administration that understands itself to be establishing precedents that will outlast its own duration. The garden behind the house moves through its own seasonal changes, the spring plantings, the summer abundance, the autumn clearing, the bare winter geometry of beds and paths under frost, a private world of growing things persisting quietly behind the public face of the executive mansion. The second term draws toward its close through 1796, and into the early months of 1797, the President's House continuing its formal functions while the farewell address, composed with the careful attention to posterity that marks all of Washington's most considered acts, moves through the printing presses of the Philadelphia newspapers and outward along the post roads of the Republic. The address exists first as a document on the writing table of the private office, the candlelight falling across its careful script in the evening hours, the words on the page carrying the weight of a considered conclusion, the counsel of a man who has spent 8 years learning what the office requires and what the Republic needs, offered to a nation that will continue without him. March of 1797 arrives in Philadelphia with the cold clarity of early spring, the streets still carrying the chill of winter in their cobblestones, the Delaware running gray and cold past the wharves to the east, the sky above the city pale and clear in the morning hours. The President's House returns to its ordinary status as the administration concludes, its formal rooms quieting after the farewell ceremonies, the official furniture remaining in its arranged positions as the private life of the house reasserts itself around the departing occupant. The streets of Philadelphia in the days following the inauguration of the new administration carry the ordinary sounds and smells of a city going about its business. The post riders moving through the morning streets. The market stalls open along High Street, the harbour receiving its vessels with the indifferent efficiency of a port that has seen many arrivals and departures and assigns to none of them more significance than the commerce they represent. The road south from Philadelphia opens through the Maryland countryside in the pale light of a March morning, the fields bare and frost-silvered on either side, the bare trees standing against a sky that carries the first tentative suggestion of the season's turning. The Potomac appears through the trees of its Maryland bank, wide and cold, and moving with the unhurried authority of a river that has been flowing past the same shores since long before anyone thought to build a nation on its banks. The Virginia side receives the traveler into its familiar landscape, the red clay of the roads, the arrangement of fields and woodlands that the eye has known across a lifetime of departure and return. Mount Vernon waits above the river in the late afternoon light, its white columns pale against the darkening sky, the Potomac moving past below in its eternal southward passage, patient and indifferent, and carrying everything downstream toward the sea. The Potomac in the spring of 1797 runs high with the season's rain, the river swollen to its banks and beyond them, the low meadows below the Mount Vernon lawn lying under a sheet of brown water that catches the April light and holds it in long, trembling reflections. The smell of the flooded bottomland carries across the estate on the morning breeze, that deep, mineral richness of river sediment spread across the grass, the particular fertility of a landscape renewed by the water that passes over it. The mansion above the lawn stands in its composed arrangement, the white columns of the piazza pale in the spring light, the cupola above the roofline turning its weathervane in the river wind. The estate receives its most famous resident back into its familiar embrace with the quiet certainty of a place that has been waiting, tending its own life through the years of absence, keeping its fields and its river and its seasonal rhythms in the patient order of things that do not require instruction. The rooms of the mansion resume their domestic character with a gradual, unhurried thoroughness. The formal dining room, which has hosted the ceremonial dinners of a presidency, returns to the warmer and less regulated hospitality of a private household. The private study reassembles itself around the work of an estate rather than a government. The correspondence on the writing table, addressed to neighbors and agricultural correspondents and former officers rather than foreign ministers and congressional committees. The candle in its silver holder burns through the evening hours over letters that concern the rotation of crops and the condition of the gristmill and the accounts of the distillery rather than the affairs of a republic. The leather-bound volumes on the shelves carry their familiar patina of regular handling, the maps on the walls showing the farms of the Mount Vernon estate in their surveyed particulars rather than the strategic geography of a continent. The morning light on the Potomac from the piazza is the morning light that the estate has always offered, the river catching the early sun on its moving surface, the Maryland shore across the water holding its dark line of trees against the brightening sky, the whole view composing itself each morning with the unhurried reliability of a landscape that has no reason to change. The smell of the kitchen garden in summer reaches the piazza on warm afternoons, the boxwood and lavender, and the sweeter fragrance of the flowering beds mixing with the river smell that rises from the lawn below. The sound of the gristmill on Dog Creek carries across the surrounding fields in the still morning air, its wheel turning in the clear water with the patient, continuous motion of a mechanism in harmony with its power source, the rhythmic sound becoming part of the estate's ambient music, alongside the birdsong and the wind in the river trees. The agricultural work of these final years proceeds with the systematic attention of an owner who approaches the land as both vocation and inquiry. The 16-sided threshing barn that Washington designed and oversaw in its construction stands as the most distinctive addition to the estate's working buildings, its unusual geometry rising from the ground near the river farm, its interior arranged for the efficient threshing of grain by horses moving in their circular path across the perforated floor, the grain falling through to the level below. The distillery on the estate expands through these years into a substantial operation, its stone building near the gristmill sending its particular smell across the surrounding ground on working days, the warm, yeasty smell of fermentation mixing with the wood smoke of the still fires, The whole complex a model of the agricultural diversification that Washington pursued with the same methodical energy he brought to every enterprise. The moral weight of this landscape is held with quiet gravity, as it has been throughout. The men and women whose labor makes the estate's productivity possible move through the same beautiful landscape that the piazza overlooks through the fields and the working buildings and the quarters where they live their constrained lives, and the narrator acknowledges their presence and their circumstances without deflection. The quarters stand near the working buildings of the estate, their modest interiors housing the people whose compelled labor sustains the agricultural machinery of Mount Vernon. The fields they tend, the crops they harvest, the buildings they maintain, all of it exists within the same landscape of river light and seasonal beauty that the mansion commands, and the beauty does not diminish the moral weight, nor does the moral weight diminish the beauty. Both are true simultaneously, held in the same honest attention. Autumn arrives at Mount Vernon in 1799 with the gradual, reliable beauty of the seasons turning. The hardwoods along the Potomac take their color in succession, the maples going first in their brief, brilliant display, the oaks holding their russet and brown longer, the whole tree line along the Maryland shore shifting through its October palette, while the river below carries these colors in its moving surface, distorting and reforming them with the current's patient indifference. The fields go bare as the harvest concludes, the soil dark and cooling in the November light, the fence posts silvering with the first frosts of the season. The Potomac runs gray under November skies, its surface carrying the flat, pewter light of the season in long, slow patterns that move downstream without urgency. December settles over the estate with the full weight of winter. The bare trees stand against a pale sky, their branches fine as ink lines drawn against the cold light, their roots gripping the frozen ground with the patient tenacity of things that have endured many winters. The river along its banks begins to freeze in the coldest stretches, the shore ice building outward from the edges in thin transparent sheets that thicken with each cold night, the main channel running dark between the ice-fringed banks. The fires burn in every room of the mansion, their amber light warm against the gray of the December days, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys into the still cold air above the house. Snow falls on the fields and the river and the distant woodland in the soft, unhurried way of a December snowfall that has no urgency in it, the flakes descending through the still air in their slow, individual paths, accumulating on every surface with the quiet thoroughness of something that intends to stay. The fence posts receive their thin white lines along their upper edges. The lawn between the mansion and the river disappears beneath a smooth covering that the morning light will render in pale gold. The Potomac carries its dark current between shores gone white, the water moving as it has always moved, southward and unhurried, carrying everything downstream toward the sea. Everything is still. The 15th of December, 1799, arrives at Mount Vernon in the particular silence that follows a great loss. A silence different in quality from the ordinary quiet of the estate, deeper and more settled, as if the house itself has drawn a long breath and held it against the cold morning air. The Potomac runs gray and cold past the lawn, its surface carrying the flat pewter light of a December morning in long, slow patterns that move downstream without urgency. The Maryland shore across the water holds its dark line of bare trees against a pale sky, the same shore that the piazza has always faced, unchanged by what has happened within the mansion above the sloping lawn. The river does not pause. It has never paused. It carries the December light southward as it has carried every quality of light through every season of the years that the mansion has stood above it, indifferent and patient and beautiful. The rooms of the mansion in these December days carry the particular quality of spaces that have absorbed a loss and not yet found their new arrangement. The study holds its familiar objects in their familiar positions, the leather-bound volumes on their shelves, the maps on the walls, the writing table with its silver inkstand and its quill pen resting in its holder beside papers that will not be completed. The candle in its silver holder has burned down to its dish. The fire in the hearth has been tended by hands other than those that tended it through the long evenings of the preceding years, and it burns at the same level it always burned, warming the same room, casting the same amber light across the same wide plank floor, indifferent to the change in the house around it. The family tomb set into the hillside above the river is a modest construction of brick and stone. surrounded by cedar trees whose dark evergreen holds its color through the winter months when everything else has gone bare. The river is visible through the cedar branches from the tomb's position on the hillside, a glimpse of moving grey water between the dark green of the trees, the Maryland shore beyond it, the pale sky above. The ground around the tomb is frozen, the grass gone brown and frost-silvered, the cedar trees standing in their quiet permanence above the cold earth. Here the man who shaped a nation is returned to the landscape that shaped him, to the Virginia soil and the river light and the cedar shade, the Potomac moving past below as it moved past on the February morning when his story began. The nation absorbs the loss through the weeks and months that follow in the way that nations absorb the loss of their founding figures, gradually, incompletely, the absence becoming a presence of a different kind. The physical environments associated with Washington's life continue their own existence without him. The Rappahannock moves past the red clay banks of Ferry Farm. The Ohio Valley wilderness stands in its enormous silence. The fields of Valley Forge return to their agricultural purposes. The Assembly Room in Philadelphia receives its ordinary light through its tall windows. The environments persist while the man who moved through them becomes something else, a name, a portrait, a principle, a presence felt in the spaces he inhabited rather than seen within them. The new capital city rising on the banks of the Potomac in the years after Washington's death takes its name from the man whose estate stands a few miles downriver. The marshy lowlands of the river's tidal reaches receive the construction of a city with the patient indifference of land that has been many things before and will be many things again. The Capitol building rises on its eastern hill through the early years of the new century, its dome visible from the river as a white form against the sky. The President's house takes shape on its own rise of ground to the west, its white-painted stone facade catching the Potomac light with a luminosity that the surrounding landscape of raw construction and muddy roads cannot diminish. Between them, the broad avenue that connects the two buildings cuts through the marshy ground in a straight line that exists first on paper, and then, gradually, in the physical world, the city taking shape from wilderness with the slow, deliberate progress of a plan being executed across decades. The Washington Monument rises above the Capitol in the years after the middle of the century, the white marble obelisk ascending from its base on the Mall, in the long, patient construction of a memorial that outlasts the men who begin it. The marble catches the morning light on its eastern face with a brilliance that the surrounding landscape of grass and water and sky cannot match, a vertical accent in a horizontal world, its reflection descending into the reflecting pool below in a perfect inverted image that the wind occasionally disturbs and the water always restores. The Mall stretches away from the monument's base toward the Capitol on the eastern horizon, the long rectangle of grass and water composing itself in the morning light with the formal beauty of a landscape designed to be seen from a great distance and understood as a whole. Mount Vernon itself persists through the decades and the centuries in the careful preservation of those who understood what it represented. The mansion is maintained as it appeared in Washington's time, the white-painted facade above the sloping lawn, the piazza open to the river, the formal gardens in their geometric arrangement behind the house, the working buildings of the estate standing in their historical positions. The grounds are kept in their historical arrangement, the seasonal cycles of the landscape continuing their ordinary business of growth and dormancy and renewal. Visitors come along the river road and along the paths of the estate, moving through the same spaces that the estate's original occupant moved through, seeing the same river from the same piazza, standing in the same study where the candle burned low in its silver holder through many long evenings. The Potomac River receives the documentary's final attention as it deserves, as the constant presence that underlies every chapter of this story, the element of the landscape that connects the February morning of 1732 to the December morning of 1799 and to every morning since. The river at Mount Vernon in the course of a single winter day moves through its full range of light and character with the unhurried completeness of something that has been performing this movement since long before anyone arrived to observe it. Dawn brings the pale gold of first light to the river's surface, the water catching the earliest color of the eastern sky and holding it in long, slow reflections that shift as the current moves beneath them. The Maryland shore across the water emerges gradually from the darkness of the preceding night, its tree line resolving from a dark mass into individual forms as the light strengthens, the bare winter branches becoming distinct against the brightening sky. The morning mist that sometimes lies along the river's surface in the cold hours before sunrise thins and disperses as the light increases, the water emerging from its grey obscurity into the full clarity of a winter morning. Midday brings the blue of a clear winter sky to the river's surface, the water running dark green in the channel, the ice along the banks catching the direct sun in brief, cold glitter. The Maryland shore stands sharp and clear across the water, every tree individually legible in the winter light, the whole view composed with the particular clarity that cold air and winter sun produce together. The afternoon light descends toward amber and then rose as the sun moves toward the Virginia horizon behind the mansion. The river holds these colors on its surface with the same patient attention it gives to every quality of light the sky offers, the amber deepening to rose, the rose softening to the pale gray of winter dusk, the Maryland shore darkening against the fading sky until it becomes again the dark line of trees that it was in the earliest morning hours. The river carries everything and releases everything, moving always toward the sea, as it did before Washington was born and as it does still, unhurried and indifferent and beautiful, the eternal shore of a landscape that remembers nothing and forgets nothing, that simply continues, patient as water, flowing always forward into whatever morning comes next.